Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. That's what Wall Street's Gordon Gekko told us, and 80s fantasy cinema really took that to heart. The American New Wave was over. The experimental stuff faded out, and what we got instead was this giant gold-plated wave of excess. Fantasy films in the 80s didn't care about subtlety. They were loud, they were messy, and sometimes they were just straight-up terrible. But somehow, we still love them. Some of these movies still hold up in weird ways. Others? Absolute train wrecks. But that's what makes this part of the list fun. Let's start with Hawk the Slayer. And seriously, how did this movie even happen? It's got all the fantasy cliches, a magic sword, an evil brother, a band of adventurers made up of one of everything. An elf, a dwarf, a giant, a nun. They're all fighting their way through the most suspicious-looking forests in the UK, dodging fog machines that clearly weren't supposed to be on full blast. The plot's barely there. It plays like someone read the back of a Dungeons & Dragons manual and just started filming. The action borrows more from westerns than actual fantasy, including sword fights staged like Mexican standoffs and even panpipe music like it's a spaghetti western. The lead actor's wooden as hell, but Jack Palance shows up as the villain and just completely goes for it. He's snarling and shouting like he's in a different movie, and honestly, he's the best part. You can tell the crew probably had a blast making this, and somehow that energy almost saves it. Next is Time Bandits. And yeah, this one's a different beast. Terry Gilliam directed it, so you already know it's going to be weird. It's about a group of time-traveling dwarves who steal from history, and they drag along this kid named Kevin through all these different time periods, from ancient Greece to Napoleonic France. Visually, the movie is stunning. The sets, the costumes, the transitions, it's creative as hell, and critics at the time respected the ambition. But it also has that problem Gilliam runs into sometimes. The story gets lost in the style. It was a hit when it came out, but it didn't stick. A few years later, Baron Munchausen, a kind of spiritual sequel, flopped hard, and Time Bandits kind of faded with it. Still, it's got some incredible moments. Ian Holm as Napoleon is hilarious. The tone is all over the place, but that's part of the fun. It's fantasy with a heavy dose of 80s chaos, and even when it doesn't land, you can't say it's boring. This one actually gets a lot right, but still ended up forgotten. It's set in this gritty medieval world where everything looks dirty. The armor's busted, the fingernails are gross, and the dragon, when it finally shows up, is awesome. They actually hold back the full reveal Jaws style, and it makes the big moments hit harder. There's blood, there's nudity, characters die. For what was basically a Disney-backed kids' fantasy movie, it was way edgier than you'd expect. But it also played it too safe when it came to originality. The story's pretty standard. A sorcerer's apprentice steps up to fight a dragon and save the kingdom. You've seen it before. It flopped, even with Disney money behind it. And instead of doubling down on original fantasy ideas, Disney just pivoted towards scooping up existing IP, Star Wars, Marvel, the stuff you can cash in on. Dragon Slayer was too early, too earnest, and it didn't pay off. But if you go back and watch it now, it's honestly better than a lot of the fantasy stuff that came after. Just don't expect the dragon to show up in the first half hour. Easily one of the most recognizable fantasy films from the early 80s, and definitely the most loved from that year. But let's not pretend it's perfect. This is the one with Perseus, Medusa, giant scorpions, sea monsters. The full Greek mythology package. Ray Harryhausen did the stop-motion creatures, and yeah, they're clunky by today's standards. But back then, this was a flex. He was still doing it old school, building every monster by hand. Even if it looks stiff now, it's got heart. Now, there is some bloat. The movie adds stuff to the myth it really didn't need, like they throw in giant creatures that weren't even part of the original story, just for spectacle. But still, the whole movie feels like a tribute to the adventure epics of the 50s and 60s. You're not watching it for historical accuracy or nuanced character arcs. You're here for gods throwing lightning bolts and claymation monsters turning people to stone. This is peak early 80s fantasy trash, and I mean that as a compliment. The story is basically Conan-light. A baby gets stolen by a witch, raised in the wilderness, and grows up to be a shirtless dude named Dar who can talk to animals. Mark Singer plays Dar, and he's got the look. Muscle-bound, mostly shirtless, very Conan adjacent. There's a love interest, a weird cult, a villain played by Rip Torn wearing a giant nose prosthetic for some reason, and a bunch of side characters that feel like they wandered in from other fantasy movies. It didn't bomb, but it barely made a dent in theaters. Still, it got 2 sequels and became a cable TV staple. So much so that people joked that TBS stood for the Beastmaster station because it aired constantly in the 90s. Out of all the sword and sorcery knockoffs that came out around this time, the Beastmaster is one of the few that actually stuck. Not because it was great, but because it knew what it was and didn't try to be more than that. Trying to explain what Krull actually is, not easy. It's part fantasy, part science fiction, part fairy tale, and somehow still a space opera. The story starts like your standard medieval quest. Kidnapped princess, brave prince, mystical weapons, and then out of nowhere, an alien army shows up with spaceships and laser guns. And I gotta say, you have to respect the ambition. There's nothing else quite like it. The movie throws everything at the wall. Magic, monsters, cosmic horror, flaming horses, and this weird organic spaceship that teleports around. It's a total mashup of Star Wars, Excalibur, and whatever was left in George Lucas's trash pile. Krull bombed hard at the box office. Hollywood basically tried to bury it, but it's stuck around because there's really nothing else like it, and even with all its weird choices, it's still fun. This is probably the artsiest movie on my list, and easily one of the most misunderstood. Directed by Neil Jordan and co-written with Angela Carter, it's basically Little Red Riding Hood turned into a dreamlike werewolf horror story. The effects were solid, the visuals are beautiful, and even Angela Lansbury plays a twisted version of the grandmother. But it was way too much for audiences at the time. The movie's built like a puzzle, stories inside stories, and most people just weren't ready to follow that in a fantasy movie. It made its budget back barely, but never took off. It ended up becoming one of those forgotten 80s films that only really lives on through film students and people deep into horror fantasy hybrids. It deserved better, but yeah, it's a slow burn and not for casual viewers. This one's a medieval romance where a couple is cursed. She turns into a hawk during the day, he turns into a wolf at night. They're always near each other but never human at the same time. It's a strong setup and surprisingly it holds together. Rutger Hauer, usually playing the bad guy, takes the lead as the hero here, and he's great. Michelle Pfeiffer plays Isabeau, the woman cursed to hawk form, and yeah, it's Pfeiffer at her most ethereal. You totally buy why men would lose their minds over her. The cast is solid. John Wood makes for a creepy villain and Leo McKern gives it some weight as a friar who's trying to break the curse. But the real wildcard here is Matthew Broderick. He plays a thief named Philippe, kind of a smartass with a heart of gold. He's the comic relief but also weirdly central to the plot. So why did Lady Hawk get buried? 2 reasons. The stakes are small, it's just about 2 people trying to break a curse, and the score. The soundtrack is a synth-heavy mess, like full-on 80s synth rock layered over sword fights and horseback scenes. It's jarring as hell and throws off the tone constantly. Even Richard Donner, the director, admitted he just used music he was listening to on his Walkman while scouting. Not exactly a great reason. With a better score, this movie probably would have hit harder. Instead, it's mostly remembered as a missed opportunity with a great cast. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger calls this the worst movie I ever made, and that's saying something. It was supposed to be the next big thing in the barbarian subgenre, right after Conan. But everything about this movie is off. First, Arnold's in it, but he's not playing Conan. He's just a random strong guy. But he still takes over most of the movie, which makes no sense since it's supposed to be Sonya's story. The story is super generic and barely connects to the original Red Sonja comics or the character's roots, and any feminist edge the character had got buried. In the comics, Sonja is tough, independent, refuses to be touched. Here, she's mostly just there. Add to that confusing Conan crossovers, a bland plot, and a cast that feels like they're in 3 different movies, and you've got a mess. It bombed and pretty much killed the genre for years. At this point, Red Sonja deserves a proper remake, with a lead actress and director who actually care about the character. You'd think with George Lucas behind the story and Ron Howard directing, this would have been a slam dunk, but Willow came out right when fantasy fatigue was setting in. Studios had already burned through a bunch of sword and sorcery movies, and audiences weren't as hungry for it anymore. Even though Willow had a bigger budget and major names, it couldn't hit the mark. The story is classic fantasy: chosen baby, evil queen, a hero with a sword. Warwick Davis plays Willow, and even though he's the actual lead, he didn't get top billing. That went to Val Kilmer and Joanna Whalley. Kilmer, to be fair, steals the show once he shows up. He's chaotic, funny, and actually gives the movie some energy. The first half drags, though. It takes way too long to get moving. The monsters aren't great, the magic scenes are clunky, and some of the humor is just straight up childish. But once the action kicks in, the movie gets way better.